He thought they were gone forever, his twin daughters, lost to the cruel hand of fate. 3 years later, on a dusty bus, he hears their voices singing alive, but carrying secrets darker than death itself. What he discovers that day doesn't just shatter his heart. It destroys everything he thought he knew about his life. Where are you watching this story from? Let us know in the comments below. If you love these tales of hope, betrayal, and redemption, don't forget to subscribe for more. Now, sit back and dive into this unforgettable journey. The wind was dry enough to peel the skin off your bones, and the sun had baked the earth into cracked, angry clay. I stood at the edge of what used to be my father's ranch, looking out over a field that hadn't grown a damn thing in months. Dust blew where wheat once swayed. Bones of cattle littered the far pasture like forgotten promises. The well was down to its last spit of water. And the bank, well, the bank had stopped sending polite letters. The last one came nailed to my door like a coffin lid. 30 days to pay, or they'd take everything. I wasn't praying when I dropped to my knees that morning. I didn't believe in that kind of salvation anymore. I was just tired. Tired of fighting a losing battle against the sun, against the drought, against time itself. That's when the old man rode up. Cornelius Slade wasn't the kind of man you ignored. His boots were polished in a way that didn't belong to dust towns like ours. His teeth were gold, his eyes sharp enough to gut a man without drawing his gun. He sat high in the saddle, looking down on me like he owned the dirt I was choking on. And maybe he did. Slade owned just about everything west of Dust Creek, including half the people. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. Told me he'd heard about my troubles. Said he had a solution. 1 cow his finest in exchange for 1 vow. His daughter Adelaide, 26, unmarried. And, as he put it, not exactly dainty, but willing. That word stuck with me. I should have known better. You don't get something for nothing out here. And nothing comes free from a man like Slade. But I was desperate. Desperate men do foolish things. I said yes. The wedding was a blur. A preacher I didn't recognize. A church that smelled like rot. Adelaide wore a plain brown dress and a look that didn't fit her face, not nervous, not shy. Something colder, smarter. Her hand trembled when she took mine, but not from fear. I told myself I was imagining it. When the preacher said husband and wife, I felt the last piece of my pride snap like old fence wire. But all I could think about was that cow tied up in Slade's barn, fat and healthy. That cow was the only reason I was still standing. The only reason I hadn't taken my father's rifle into the barn and ended it all. That night, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Adelaide didn't speak as she unpacked her single bag, didn't ask questions, didn't offer comfort, just moved like a ghost through the shadows of my broken home. I tried to offer her the bedroom, figuring I'd take the floor. But before I could, she stepped inside and turned the key in the lock. I didn't move. Couldn't. Something in her silence froze me in place. Then she spoke, for the first time since the ceremony. I'm not who you think I am. Her voice was calm, dead calm. My name's not Adelaide, and I'm not Slade's daughter. I felt the room tilt. I stepped forward, but she held up a hand, and I stopped like she'd shot me. I'm Catherine Walsh. Adelaide Quinn died 2 years ago. Fever, they said. Poison, in truth. The next words came like hammer blows. Slade had taken everything from her family land, cattle, water rights. Just like mine. He'd done it with forged documents and bribes. And when Adelaide, the real one, found out, he'd killed her. Catherine had slipped into her place to finish what her sister started. I thought she'd come to my ranch for the cow, for the safety. But she came for war. And I just married into it. She showed me papers, witnesses, maps. Enough proof to hang Slade 3 times over. But none of it meant anything if no one lived to tell the tale. She needed someone desperate enough to take the bait. Someone no one would question marrying a woman like Adelaide. That was me. I wanted to scream, to drag her out and throw her to the coyotes. But deep down, I knew something else. I'd been hunting Slade in my own way for years. I hadn't gathered proof. I didn't have maps or papers. I had scars, memories, debt, pain. That man didn't just take my cattle. He took my life, my father's honor, my family's name, my future. So I sat down on the edge of the bed, the same bed my parents once shared, and said nothing. Because what was there to say? We both wanted the same thing. And the war had already begun. The night after our wedding was silent in a way that wasn't natural. Not the peaceful kind of silence either. No chirping crickets, no howling coyotes, not even the soft rustle of wind through brittle weeds. It was the kind of stillness that came before something bad. The kind I remembered from the war, when every man in the trench held his breath waiting for the first shot. Catherine, no, not Adelaide, was sitting at my father's old desk, candlelight dancing across the open pages of a leather-bound ledger. Her eyes flicked across the paper with precision, her fingers tracing lines of numbers and notes in a language only the vengeful understand. I watched from the doorway. She didn't acknowledge me. She didn't need to. She was in control now. And I, the fool who thought I was buying hope with a wedding vow, had been bought instead. But she wasn't the only one keeping secrets. I'd spent years letting folks think I was just another hard-luck rancher kicked down by fate and drought. That suited me fine. I let them see the dry fields and the empty well, the foreclosure notices and the hunger behind my eyes. What they didn't see was the ledger I kept hidden in the floorboards beneath my bed, a book filled not with numbers, but with names. Men who'd worked for Slade, men who'd lied, stolen, or disappeared, men who'd taken what wasn't theirs, and left nothing but ash behind. I didn't trust Catherine. Not yet. But I understood her. We were both survivors. Both fueled by the same poison. Justice with a bitter aftertaste of revenge. She broke the silence first. Your father sold water rights to Slade 12 years ago, didn't he? I didn't answer. She didn't wait. Except he didn't. Slade forged the signature. Same as he did with mine. She turned the ledger so I could see. My father's name, scrawled in neat handwriting that didn't match any letter he ever wrote me. I know forgery when I see it, she said. That ink's too clean. Too new. Signed with a pen that didn't even exist back then. She'd done her homework. More than I had. And it stung not because I was wrong, but because I'd spent years nursing a wound I didn't know the shape of. He's been stealing from both our families longer than either of us realized, she added. I didn't like being dragged into her plans. But I hated being played for a fool even more. I walked to the stove, poured 2 cups of boiled rainwater, handed her one. She took it without a word. You planning to kill him? I asked. She didn't flinch. Eventually. The fire in her voice didn't scare me. What scared me was how familiar it sounded, like my own thoughts echoing back in someone else's mouth. She closed the ledger and stood, walking to the bedroom door. I watched her every move. She wasn't graceful. Not in the way you read about in city romance papers. But there was something sharp about her. Every step was calculated. Like she knew this house better than I did. Like she belonged here more than I did. Before she entered the room, she turned back. You want to stay alive? You'll start acting like we're really married. She said it with no emotion, no sarcasm. Just a command, plain and cold. When the door closed behind her, I didn't follow. I stayed by the stove, staring into the last glowing coals, wondering how much of my soul I'd just sold for a cow and a stranger's last name. By morning, the sky was the color of old parchment, and the heat was already rising. I walked out to the barn and found her there before me, feeding the cow. That cow the reason all this started. She was brushing its neck gently, whispering something I couldn't hear. It looked peaceful under her touch, and that unsettled me more than anything. She turned and handed me a folded piece of parchment. Map of the territory, Slade's land, mines, wells, dead claims. He's been buying up everything east of Dead Rock Canyon. There's something out there he wants. I unfolded it, eyes scanning the worn lines. She'd marked certain spots with red ink. One in particular caught my eye, a ridge with no name, deep in the canyon. I knew that place. My father used to call it the Devil's Thumb. Said nothing grew there. Said even the coyotes gave it wide berth. You think he's hiding something out there? I know he is. She said, that's where my father was last seen alive. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. What exactly do you want from me? I asked. She looked at me like the answer should be obvious. Slade's watching me now. He thinks I'm settled, harmless. But you're invisible. Broken rancher. Poor husband. Nothing left to lose. He'll never see you coming. I didn't like being someone's pawn, but being invisible had its uses. Let's say I help you, I said. What's your endgame? She didn't hesitate. Expose him, ruin him, make him answer for everything. My sister, your father, everyone else he buried beneath lies and stolen land. And if it doesn't work? She met my eyes, her voice flat. Then we both burn. That evening, as the sky turned copper and the wind rose in restless gusts, I saddled up the only horse I had left and rode into town. Catherine stayed behind, pretending to be the new bride, the dutiful wife. She'd even baked a pie for appearance's sake, the kind of performance that made neighbors talk less and watch less. Dust Creek hadn't changed much. The saloon still stank of sweat and spilled whiskey. The sheriff still played poker with men who paid him to look the other way. And Cornelia Slade still held court in the back room, surrounded by loyal dogs in hats and tin stars. I didn't go near him. Not yet. I just listened. Bought a drink I couldn't afford, tipped the piano man for a song I didn't like, and sat with my ears open. You can learn a lot when people think you're beneath their notice. What I heard that night made my blood run cold. Slade had plans for us. He'd bought my debt not to help, but to own. That cow wasn't a gift. It was a leash, and when the time came, he'd pull hard. According to a man 2 stools down, Slade planned to call in my debt by month's end, foreclose, claim the land, and add my acreage to his growing empire. The marriage was a formality, a show, and I, the broken rancher, was just a tool to move pawns across a bigger board. I left the saloon with clenched fists and a head full of fire. Catherine had underestimated him. We both had. Slade wasn't just corrupt, he was methodical, patient, and worst of all, he thought he'd already won. By the time I reached the cabin, the stars were out, sharp and cruel overhead. Catherine was waiting on the porch, her silhouette framed by lantern light. You were gone longer than expected, she said. He's planning something, I replied. So are we. I handed her a note I'd swiped from the saloon's back office. It was a delivery order, crates from Tombstone arriving by week's end. No mention of contents. But I'd seen the sender's mark before. Weapons dealer. Catherine's lips tightened. He's arming up. Looks like it. She folded the paper and tucked it into her journal. We move tomorrow, she said. To where? The Devil's Thumb. Something about the way she said it made my skin crawl. That place held secrets. Buried things that didn't want to be found. But I nodded anyway, because buried in that ridge might be the truth we both needed. And if we were going to war, I wanted to know exactly what we were fighting. We left at dawn. No words were exchanged over breakfast, just 2 cups of burnt coffee, a shared glance, and the knowledge that whatever waited for us beyond the canyon was older than both our wounds and likely just as bitter. Catherine had packed the evidence, her papers, forged deeds, death records, everything into a weathered satchel and tucked it under the false bottom of the wagon. I took my rifle, the one my father carried in the war, and filled the saddlebag with cartridges. If things turned violent out there, I wasn't planning on being the one bleeding in the dirt. The Devil's Thumb wasn't far, as the crow flies maybe a day's ride, but we weren't crows. We had to take the old creek trail, which hadn't been cleared since before the drought. And even then, it was barely more than a winding scar through red dust and old grief. The locals didn't go near it. They said the land out there was cursed. They weren't wrong. The sun hadn't even peaked when the land began to change. The usual scraggly brush that clung to life out in Dust Creek gave way to something more desolate, wide stretches of parched stone, peppered with the blackened remains of long-dead trees. The air smelled different too, like rust and dry rot, like the earth had been wounded and never healed. I pulled the reins and pointed. See that ridge? That's it. The thumb. From a distance, it looked like a clenched fist breaking out of the earth, jagged and unnatural, as though it had been pushed up from below by something angry. No trails, no cattle paths, just bare rock, and the promise of answers neither of us were fully ready for. Catherine nodded, her eyes never leaving the horizon. That's where my father disappeared. Her voice was quieter than usual. Not softer, nothing about Catherine was soft but less certain, less sharp. What was he doing out here? I asked. She didn't answer for a while, just stared at that crooked peak like it might open its mouth and explain itself. Trying to prove Slade stole the water rights. He found an old, well-natural spring hidden under one of the old mines Slade claimed was dry. That's why Slade wanted it gone. My father was going to bring a federal land agent back the next day. He never made it home. I didn't press her for more. We both knew what had happened. The only question was whether Slade had buried the body deep enough. We reached the ridge by late afternoon. The horses were spooked, ears twitching, nostrils flaring, and I couldn't blame them. The place felt wrong, like it had teeth. There were 3 old mine entrances carved into the rock, long abandoned. The wooden support beams at their mouths were sun-bleached and cracked, covered in spiderwebs thick enough to look like cloth. One of them had collapsed, nothing but rubble and dust. The other 2 were still open dark holes yawning into the hill. Catherine climbed down first, lantern in hand, her boots crunching over gravel and old bones. Not animal bones either. Too long, too thin. I thought you said your father came alone, I said. He did. We stood there in the heat, the wind dead still around us, staring at a human femur half buried in the sand. Then who the hell are the others? She didn't answer, just lit the lantern and started toward the nearest shaft. Inside, it was cooler, but not by much. The air was stale, the kind that sticks to your lungs. Our footsteps echoed too loud against the stone, and every shadow seemed to twitch when the lantern passed. An old ledger nailed to the wall, barely held together by rusted nails and rot. It was covered in names, dozens of them. Men who'd sold their land to Slade, most with an X next to them. Catherine ran her fingers down the list, stopped halfway. My father. Then, lower. She pointed again. Your father. I didn't even need to look. I knew it. I'd see that damned X beside his name. Marked for silence. Marked for death. Slade's kill list, I said. My throat felt dry. And it wasn't the air. No, Catherine whispered. It's a receipt. She reached behind the ledger and pulled out a scrap of oilskin. Inside was a folded paper official-looking territorial seal still intact. A deed transfer. Signed by the sheriff. Co-signed by Marshal Warren. Forgery, she said. But I shook my head. No. Not this one. She looked at me, confused. I took the paper, turned it over, and showed her the watermark, a custom stamp that only one man in the entire county used. Judge Harlan. Slade's cousin. He did it legally, paper trail and all. That's why no one's ever touched him. Every murder had a cover, every theft, a signature. Catherine looked like she might be sick. I didn't blame her. How many? She asked. So many. We gathered what we could, the ledger, the deed, and a few crates tucked behind rotting boards. One of them was stamped with a symbol I recognized from the saloon, the weapons crate. Catherine pried it open. Inside, rifles, ammunition, and a sealed envelope addressed to Marshal Warren. We didn't open it yet. Some things are better read with a rifle nearby. The sun was starting to sink by the time we emerged. The air was cooler now, but not by much. The horses were still there, but restless. Something had spooked them. Then we heard it. The distant sound of hoofbeats, not ours, not random, coming fast. We froze, hearts pounding. How could they know? Catherine hissed. Someone talked, I said. Or maybe they've been watching this place all along. We didn't wait. Threw the satchel onto the wagon, kicked the horses into motion, and tore out of the canyon like the devil himself was behind us. And for the first time in a long while, I think he was. We made it halfway back before we realized they weren't following. That was the worst part. They knew we were there, and they let us leave. When we returned to the ranch, the cabin door was open. Nothing was taken. Nothing was touched. But sitting in the center of the table was a single bullet, polished and clean. Catherine stared at it for a long time. Then she spoke. Voice hollow. He's warning us. I nodded. He knows we found something, and he wants us to know he knows. She sat down slowly, the weight of it all pressing her into the chair like gravity itself had turned against her. "What do we do now?" she asked. I looked at the bullet, picked it up, rolled it between my fingers. "Now?" I said. "Now we stop playing defense." She looked up at me, something hard returning to her eyes. "You have a plan?" I nodded. "I've been building one since the day he stole my land." Her voice was hoarse. "Then let's finish what we started." I placed the bullet back on the table and turned toward the door. Out in the distance, the town lay quiet under a blanket of dusk. But not for long. Slade had written our names in his little black ledger. He just didn't know we were still holding the pen. I had forgotten what rage felt like. Real rage. Not the kind that simmers quietly in a man's chest while he tills dry earth and buries memories with his own two hands. No, this was different. This was hot, raw, and alive. The kind of rage that makes a man plan. For the first time since Catherine stepped onto my land with her ghost of a name and fire in her veins, I felt something close to purpose. Not revenge, not yet, but something with sharp teeth and direction. We had names now. Documents. Proof that Slade hadn't just taken what was mine, but what had once belonged to a dozen others. Maybe more. That ledger wasn't a list. It was a graveyard, and I intended to dig it up. We split the work. Catherine took the paper trail, the forged deeds, the false signatures, the sealed letter we found addressed to Marshal Warren. Her education wasn't just for show. She knew how to talk like them, how to move in courts and offices. And she had one thing none of us ever had in that town, a legitimate claim to Slade's land. But before anything could be presented, before a judge could raise an eyebrow or a clerk could whisper down a hallway, we needed allies. And that part was mine. I rode out before dawn. Didn't tell her where I was going, just said I'd be gone 2 days. She didn't ask questions. Smart girl. Because if I had told her what I planned, she might have tried to stop me. I headed east, past the edge of Dust Creek, beyond the dried-up cattle runs and the abandoned mills where Slade's greed had left nothing but ash. I followed the broken riverbed until I reached the hills, the ones where the dirt turned black and the sky felt heavier. That's where they lived now, the old ones. Men who once wore badges but traded them for whiskey and silence. Outlaws not by choice, but by consequence. One of them was my uncle. I hadn't seen him in years. He used to ride with my father back when they thought justice was something you could carve into the side of a saloon with a Bowie knife. Back before Slade bought off every man with a tin star. They called him Dusty Jack. Not because of the roads he rode, but because of the trail of corpses he left behind. He was sharpening a blade when I found him, hunched beside a fire like some mountain prophet. His beard was longer, eyes more bloodshot than I remembered. But when he saw me, he didn't flinch. "Didn't think I'd see you again," he muttered. "Didn't think I'd come," I replied. He didn't offer coffee or a seat. "Why are you here?" I threw the ledger into the dirt between us. He picked it up, squinting. After a minute, he whistled. "God damn. Thought he burned all these. So did I." Jack looked up, face tight, with something between amusement and anger. "You want help?" "I want blood," I said. He grinned. "Now you're talking." When I returned to the ranch, 2 days later, Catherine was sitting on the porch with a half-loaded rifle and a telegram in her hand. She didn't even look up. "You went to the hills?" "I did. And they'll come." She nodded once. "Good. Because so will they." She handed me the telegram. It was signed by Judge Tannen from Silver Gulch, one of the only men left in the territory who hadn't bowed to Slade's coin. Catherine had sent copies of the forged deeds, the original records, and a plea for injunction. And he'd agreed. "If we can make it to Silver Gulch," she said, "he'll hear the case. In front of the full circuit. Slade can't buy them all." I looked at her, both impressed and a little afraid. She was no longer hiding behind false names and borrowed vengeance. She was becoming something else. The woman Slade had tried to erase, but we both knew what it meant. Silver Gulch was 3 days' ride, across open land, dangerous land. If Slade caught wind of what we carried, he wouldn't wait for court. He'd send guns. So we prepared. For 2 nights, we dug trenches around the ranch, laid out tripwire and covered dry brush with kerosene. I reinforced the walls of the barn, turned it into a makeshift fortress. Catherine gathered everything she could carry: the evidence, the documents, and the sealed envelope from the mine. We hadn't opened it yet. Until now, it was short, only a few lines. To be opened in event of my death. Slade owns the sheriff. He owns the bank, but he doesn't own me. The gold is real. He killed them for it. There's more under the second shaft. Burn it all. It was signed Marshall Warren. Catherine stared at the page, mouth open. He knew, she said. He tried to stop it, and he died for it. I folded the letter and tucked it back into the envelope. Then we don't just expose Slade, I said. We end him. On the 3rd morning, we saw them. 4 riders, all in black, coming slow. Slade didn't send an army. He sent a message. Each man wore a red band tied around the barrel of his rifle. No mistake. That was the mark of Slade's private enforcers, former bounty men who'd been thrown out of the Marshal Corps for being too cruel. One of them, I recognized. Jeb Dog Eye Holtz. He'd shot my cousin in the back when he refused to sell his land. Said it was self-defense. Catherine saw me tighten my grip on the rifle. You know him? I owe him something. They stopped just beyond rifle range. Waited. Dog Eye raised a hand and called out, "We're not here to kill you, just to talk." I said nothing. He kept going. "Slade wants the papers, the ones you stole." Catherine stepped forward. "We didn't steal anything." Semantics. Dog Eye smirked. "You hand them over, you live, you ride for Silver Gulch, you don't make it halfway." I raised the rifle. Didn't aim, just let him see it. "Tell Slade we're coming anyway." He paused, then grinned. "Then we'll be waiting." They turned, slow and calm, and rode off. Not afraid. Not yet. But they would be. That night, we didn't sleep. Just cleaned our guns, packed what little food we had, and waited for the sky to turn gray. At dawn, we'd ride for Silver Gulch. Me, with blood in my mouth and fire in my chest. Catherine, with every ghost of her past burning behind her. And somewhere in those hills, Jack and the others would be waiting, sharpening their knives, ready to repay old debts. We weren't outlaws. Not yet. But by the time we reached that courthouse, the whole territory would know one thing. Slade wasn't the law anymore. They say the land remembers blood. Not in the way a man remembers, through tears or trembling hands, but in silence. In the way grass refuses to grow where a body once rotted. In the way birds don't sing near a tree that once held a noose. The road to Silver Gulch was full of those memories. We started before the sun, packs strapped tight, weapons loaded. Catherine rode ahead, her back straight and eyes sharp, the rifle slung across her saddle like it had grown there. I followed a few paces behind, keeping an eye on the horizon and an ear tuned to the wind. There was no room for conversation. Not now. Every mile we crossed was a mile Slade would try to claim. The first day was quiet. Too quiet. We cut across the old mining trail, the one that hadn't seen a wagon in years. The path was cracked and brittle, like skin left too long in the sun. 1,000 feet above us, hawks circled slow, wide arcs, watching. By dusk, we made camp near a dry creek bed. Catherine gathered wood while I set traps in the brush. My hands moved without thinking, like they were working off instinct more than memory. I'd done this before, so had she. We were no longer strangers pretending to be husband and wife. We were soldiers now. Before we ate, Catherine reached into her satchel and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. I'd seen it before once, tucked under her cot back at the ranch. "What is that?" I asked. She didn't look up. "My father's journal." She opened it to a page halfway through. Ran her fingers across the ink. "He wrote everything down," she whispered. "Every deal Slade made. Every threat. Every man who took a bribe and every widow left with nothing." I watched her face harden. "This doesn't end with land," she said. It ends with truth. I nodded. Then I put more wood on the fire. Because truth alone doesn't stop bullets. On the second day, we reached the cliffs. High ridges lined the road, narrow enough for an ambush. I slowed my horse and scanned the stone above us. Catherine rode with her hand resting near her pistol, eyes flicking from shadow to shadow. We didn't say it aloud. Someone was watching. And just past the second ridge, they showed themselves. 4 riders. Black dusters. Red bands. Slate's men. Not the same ones from the ranch, these were younger, meaner. Hired killers with nothing to lose and everything to prove. The leader had a scar across his cheek and teeth yellow from chewing cactus. He didn't draw his gun. Not yet. "Where are you headed?" he called out. Catherine didn't answer. I did. "Silver Gulch." He laughed. "You won't make it. Then shoot." A beat passed. Tension thick in the air. He tilted his head. "We don't need to. We just need what's in the saddlebags." He smiled and drew. We fired at the same time. Mine hit his shoulder, spinning him out of the saddle. Catherine's shot punched through the second man's throat, and he dropped like a sack of grain. The other 2 fired wild, spooked horses bucking. One bullet grazed my arm, a hot line of fire that tore through flesh but missed bone. I slid off the horse and took cover behind a boulder. Catherine had already dismounted, crouched low, reloading. More gunfire cracked through the canyon. A horse screamed and took off without a rider. Then silence. Dust settled. Only one of them was left breathing, the youngest, barely 20, bleeding from a gut shot, crawling backward through dirt. I walked over, gun still raised. He looked up, terrified. "Please." He didn't shoot him. Catherine stepped beside me, eyes cold. "He'll tell Slade." "Good," I said. I knelt down, grabbed his shirt, and yanked him close. "Tell him we're still coming," I hissed. "And tell him Dusty Jack says hello." The boy's eyes went wide. Then I let him go. He scrambled away, clutching his stomach, and vanished into the rocks. We buried the bodies in the canyon, not out of mercy, but because the land demands it, and because we weren't done yet. Catherine stitched my arm under moonlight, her hands steady, jaw clenched. I didn't wince. Pain was familiar now, almost comforting. Afterward, she leaned against me, silent. The fire cracked between us. "You know," she said quietly, "when I was a girl, I used to dream of running away. Not to escape, but to find him." "Your father?" She nodded. "I thought he'd be somewhere out there, waiting. That he'd see me and smile and take me home." She looked down at her hands. But he wasn't waiting. He was already buried under a lie. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. Sometimes, silence is the only honest thing a man can offer. On the 3rd day, the road forked. Left would take us through Black Hollow, an abandoned coal town turned outlaw den. Right, through the river, past flooded, dangerous, but shorter. We chose the river. Time mattered more than safety now. The current was faster than expected. Twice we nearly lost a pack. Once, almost a horse. But we pushed on, soaked to the bone, weapons wrapped in oilcloth, hearts pounding. By dusk, we reached dryland Silver Gulch, only a day away. That night, I climbed a ridge and saw the lights of the city flickering in the distance. It felt like hope, but as I turned back toward camp, I saw smoke, thick, rising, too close. I ran, gun drawn, but it was too late. Our camp had been found. The fire wasn't ours. It was a message. Scorched into the dirt with black powder was a single word, turn. And beside it, a dead coyote, skinned. Catherine stood by the remains, face pale but steady. "He's trying to scare us." "He's succeeding," I muttered. "But not enough." We moved camp, didn't sleep, took shifts. In the silence of the night, I wrote a letter. Didn't know who it was for. Maybe no one. Maybe myself. I folded it, tucked it into the lining of my coat. Just in case. Because tomorrow, vet reach Silver Gulch. And whatever happened there, we wouldn't walk away unchanged. Silver Gulch appeared just after dawn, a strip of buildings bleeding out from the edge of the hills, like a wound that never healed. Smoke drifted from crooked chimneys. Church bells stood cracked and rusted, never ringing anymore. And yet, the town moved slow, suspicious, eyes watching from shaded porches and second-story windows. We didn't ride in like heroes. We walked our horses, saddlebags torn, clothes stained with blood and river water. Catherine wore her father's journal strapped across her chest like armor. I carried my rifle in plain view. No one greeted us, but everyone saw. They always do in towns like this. First stop was the courthouse, or what passed for one, a sun-faded building with bullet holes in the walls and a crooked sign that still read Justice of the Peace, though the man inside looked more like a bartender than a judge. His name was Emery Dale. Thick mustache, lazy eye, and fingers yellowed from smoking cigars too close to the wick. I handed him a copy of the land deed. Catherine placed her father's journal on the desk beside it. He didn't open it, didn't even touch it, just stared at us. "You two don't know where you're standing," he said, "or who owns the ground under your boots." "Slade doesn't own anything," Catherine replied. "Not if the law means a damn." Dale snorted. "Law here don't work off books. It works off bullets." He slid the papers back toward us. "You should leave." I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "We're not going anywhere, and if you won't read the journal, someone else will. There's a federal marshal stationed in Carson Bluff. He'll listen." Dale flinched at the name. He didn't speak, not right away. Then he sighed. "You got 2 days," he said. "I'll set a hearing. You better pray you're gone before then." We found a room above the tannery. Stank of boiled hide and mold, but it had a lock on the door and windows that faced the street. Good enough. Catherine spread the journal across the table and began tagging entries with scraps of red ribbon. I sat by the window, watching. She was relentless. Page after page. She documented names, dates, bribes. People Slade had bought, land he'd stolen, men he'd buried. "I remember him," she whispered, pointing to a name scrawled in the margins. "This one came to our farm once. I was a child. He said he was a banker." She trailed off. I said nothing, because I recognized the name too, the same man who'd once tried to buy my father's land for less than a season's harvest. Slade's spiderweb reached farther than I'd imagined, but now it was unraveling, and he knew it. Night fell heavy in Silver Gulch. The saloon down the street erupted in music and gunfire, the usual rhythm of men trying to forget. But I didn't forget. I stayed awake while Catherine slept, polishing my rifle, watching the alley below. That's when I saw him, a shadow, tall, broad shoulders. He stood just at the edge of the lamplight, face hidden beneath a black hat, hands resting on the hilts of 2 revolvers. He didn't move. Didn't need to. I knew the message. Slade wasn't going to wait for the hearing. He was coming. The next morning, we visited the church. Not to pray, to find Pastor Harlan. He was one of the last men in town who hadn't bent the knee to Slade. Used to be a firebrand, preached against corruption, greed, the decay of the soul. Now he limped when he walked and spoke through broken teeth. "Should have stayed away," he told us. "Slade owns the judge, the sheriff, and the undertaker." "We've got proof," Catherine said, holding out the journal. Harlan took it. His hands shook. Then, slowly, he smiled. "I remember this handwriting," he whispered. "Your father, he baptized my boy. Told me once that truth was like coal, buried deep, dirty, but burning hotter than hell when lit." He looked at Catherine. "You want this read at the hearing?" She nodded. He tucked it beneath his coat. "Then I'll be there, even if it kills me." It might. We all knew it. By noon, the courthouse door was nailed shut. A fresh notice tacked across it. "Herring cancelled, truthburid." Signed by Judge Emery Dale. That was the moment the last thread snapped. Catherine tore the notice down. Her hands shook, but not from fear, from rage. "Then we take it public," I said. No more games, no more silence. She nodded. We headed to the printing press. But the building was already burning. Flames poured from the windows, thick smoke curling into the sky. A crowd gathered not to help, but to watch. Some laughed. Others just walked away. Inside, the pressman and his apprentice never made it out. They were still inside when the roof collapsed. The sheriff found us standing in the street. He had 20 men behind him, all armed. "You should run," he said. "Slade's giving you that mercy." Catherine stepped forward. "No." He blinked. I said. She raised her voice, loud enough for every soul within 100 yards. "My name is Catherine Langston. My father was murdered by Elias Slade. His journal is with the pastor. It will be read aloud tomorrow morning. If you stand in our way, you stand with murderers." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The sheriff paled, then turned and walked away. The crowd didn't follow. Some stayed. Some looked away. But they heard her. And once heard, truth cannot be undone. That night, we stayed in the church, barricaded the doors, loaded every weapon we had. Harlan prayed over us before bedding down, journal clasped to his chest like a relic. I sat by the window again, rifle across my knees. Catherine came and sat beside me. "You think we make it to morning?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. Then I nodded. "Even if we don't," I said, "the fire's lit." She leaned her head on my shoulder. Outside, Silver Gulch held its breath. Inside, we waited. One more night. One more shot at justice. They came just before dawn. Not all at once, not like a charge. Slade was smarter than that. He sent them in waves. Shadows first, then boots, then blood. We saw the first silhouette through the church window, a man in a duster coat with no face, just smoke for eyes and steel for hands. He didn't knock, didn't announce himself, just raised his rifle and fired. The bullet splintered the door frame inches from Pastor Harlan's head. Catherine was already pulling him down, dragging him behind the altar. I was already firing back. The morning of truth had begun with fire. They didn't care about the hearing anymore. They weren't trying to stop the journal. They were here to wipe the slate clean, to burn what they couldn't buy, bury what they couldn't scare. Silver Gulch had seen its fair share of shootouts, but this wasn't a duel. It was a siege. I counted at least a dozen men circling the church. Black scarves over their mouths, long guns drawn. They weren't locals. Hired guns. Ghosts in flesh. Slade's kind of justice. We held our ground. For the first hour, the pews became barricades, the altar became cover, and the stained glass windows turned into a storm of shattered color. Pastor Harlan kept the journal tucked inside his coat even as he loaded a rusted old shotgun, eyes wet but fierce. "They're not just coming for me," he said. "They're coming for truth." Catherine nodded. "Then we give it to them, one bullet at a time." We fought like cornered wolves. And it worked at first. 2 of their men went down trying to breach the north side. A third bled out crawling through broken glass. But there were too many of them. And then the fire started. Molotov bottles through the back window, flames licking the rafters, smoke pouring down like punishment from the heavens. Catherine screamed as it reached the front. "We have to move." I kicked open the cellar hatch. Smoke rushed in as we dropped into darkness. Pastor Harlan clutched the journal like a holy text, his hand shaking from pain and age. Outside, the church burned. Above us, our last shelter turned to ash. But we were alive. And that meant Slade hadn't won. Not yet. The tunnel beneath the church had been dug decades ago, some old smuggler's path, now little more than dirt and cobwebs. But it led somewhere. I prayed it was enough. Catherine guided Harlan. I took the lead. Every sound above echoed through the soil gunshots, boots, voices. Slade's men were searching for corpses. They wouldn't find any. But they'd smell the smoke on us soon enough. When we reached the exit, dawn had broken. And with it, Silver Gulch had changed. The townsfolk stood outside what remained of the courthouse, murmuring. watching the smoke rise from the church. Some held rifles. Some just held their breath. And Slade stood on the steps. Black coat, black gloves, a vulture wearing human skin. He raised his voice, loud and clear. These outlaws, he called, they burned a church, killed a man of God. They come with lies and fake papers. I'll pay $100 to the man who brings me Catherine Langston's head. The crowd didn't cheer, but they didn't move either. Fear's a hell of a muzzle. Then someone stepped forward. Sheriff Booker. No badge on his chest, he'd torn it off. "I've seen her father's journal," he said. "I believe her." Slade laughed. "You believe a corpse." But Booker didn't flinch. "She's not dead." And that's when we stepped into the square. Guns raised. Journal in hand. All eyes turned. It was the moment that split Silver Gulch in two. Everything after that happened fast. Slade screamed. His men reached for their weapons. I shot the first one before he touched his belt. Booker shot the second. Then the square became thunder. Gunfire echoed off buildings. Glass shattered. Horses panicked. And amid the chaos, Catherine ran straight toward the courthouse steps, journal held high, voice louder than I'd ever heard it. "My name is Catherine Langston. This journal holds the truth about what Slade did to my family and to this town." Bullets whistled past her. But she didn't stop, not until she reached the top step and slammed the journal down on the wooden railing. "This town belongs to its people," she shouted, "not to murderers." Silence followed, the kind that burns your ears. Then a voice from the crowd. "She's right." Another. "I knew her father. He was an honest man." Then another. Then another. Until Slade was the only one without a voice. He drew. Of course he did. Cowards always do when the crowd turns. But I was faster. My bullet tore through his shoulder, spun him backward into the courthouse door. He dropped his gun, dropped his pride, dropped everything. The sheriff stepped forward. "I'll take him from here." Slade didn't argue, didn't scream, just sat there, bleeding, staring at the journal like it was a ghost. Maybe it was. That night, we returned to what was left of the church. Pastor Harlan patched up in the doctor's office. Catherine sat beside me on the floor, the journal resting between us, stained and burned, but still whole. "You think it's over?" she asked. I shook my head. "No. But the fire's spreading." She smiled. "We started something." I nodded. "Something worth dying for." She leaned her head against mine. And outside, for the first time in a long time, Silver Gulch slept without fear. But morning always comes. And with it reckoning. The next morning came quiet. Too quiet. Slade was behind bars, bleeding pride and broken bone. The townsfolk whispered of justice. Some called it a new beginning. But nothing that bleeds is ever truly done. I stood outside the sheriff's office, watching the light shift across the dust-covered street. The town looked almost normal, wagons rolling, mothers carrying bread, men tipping hats. But I knew better. A snake doesn't die just because it lost its fangs. Sheriff Booker looked tired. Not the kind of tired a man gets from lack of sleep, the kind that settles in your bones when you've lived too long with compromise. "He's not staying locked up," he told me. "Not unless we do more." "How much more?" He set down the journal, now half charred, half golden, and looked me square in the eye. "We bring this to the circuit judge in Carson City. We make it federal. Real charges, real exposure. And Slade's men? They'll come for you. They'll come for her." Of course they would. The kind of truth we held didn't just shake foundations. It burned them down. We left that afternoon, Catherine, me, and the journal. Slade watched from his cell, eyes like old nails, rusted but sharp enough to dig. He didn't speak. But I felt the words crawling behind his silence. "I'm not done with you." We rode hard, past the canyons, through brush dry as bone and winds sharp enough to bleed. It was 2 days to Carson, 2 days between truth and death. And that was when Catherine told me there was more. More than the journal. More than her father's death. More than the lies Silver Gulch had swallowed whole. I lied to you, she said, her voice trembling. My name is Catherine Langston, but I wasn't just here for the land. I pulled the reins. The horse stopped. The sky leaned in. She took a deep breath. My father was killed by Slade. That's true. But not because of land. Not because of mining rights. She reached into her coat, pulled out something wrapped in cloth. When she unwrapped it, I saw a badge, old, rusted, but unmistakable. A marshal's badge. My father was a federal informant. He was building a case not just on Slade, but on a whole chain of men. Railroad men. Politicians. Names big enough to buy silence across 3 states. I stared at the badge. Felt the world tilt. If they find out you have that, they'll kill us both. It wasn't just about land anymore. It was about something far deeper. A network of corruption that started in our dust-caked town and stretched all the way to the capital. Slade was a piece, a pawn, and Catherine had just stepped into the center of the board. That night, we made camp in a dried-out riverbed, surrounded by red rock and silence. She sat by the fire, the badge in her lap, staring like it might bite. I asked her, "Why tell me now?" "Because if I don't make it," she said, "you need to know what's at stake." I couldn't sleep after that. Not because I feared dying, but because I feared we'd die without finishing what we started. At dawn, we heard horses. Not many, 4, maybe 5. Too fast to be travelers. Too quiet to be drunks. They weren't here for a chat. I saw the first rider's silhouette against the rising sun. All black. Scar over one eye. A bounty hunter. I recognized him. Jack Clegg. The kind of man who once skinned a man for lying about a deck of cards. Slade must fence inward. Fast. I counted 2 rifles, a repeater, and a shotgun. We were outgunned, outnumbered, but not outwitted. Catherine handed me the badge and the journal. "You run. I'll distract them." "No." She looked at me, eyes burning. "This is bigger than me. If I die, so be it. But that badge, that truth, it has to reach Carson." I gritted my teeth. Then I kissed her. Hard. And I ran. Gunfire exploded behind me. The kind that splits the earth open. He didn't look back. I couldn't. Because if he did, I'd break. Every step tore me open. Every shot was a knife in my gut. But I ran like hell itself was nipping at my heels. By sundown, I reached the canyon road. Dust choked my throat. My legs were jelly. But I kept going. And when I finally saw the railway sign, Carson City, 12 miles, I dropped to my knees and cried. Not because I made it, but because I didn't know if she had. I reached the courthouse 2 days later. The judge, old and pale with a voice like dry parchment, flipped through the journal and held up the badge like it was fire. "Do you know what this means, son?" "I do." "And you know the kind of men this implicates?" "Yes, sir." He leaned back. Then he called for a federal marshal. "I hope you know what you've started." I did. A war. But not one of bullets. One of truth. One the liars wouldn't win. That night, in a rented room above the saloon, I sat alone. The badge on the table. The journal in my lap. And then I heard the knock. 3 soft taps. I reached for my gun, heart thundering. But when I opened the door, she was there. Blood on her sleeve. Dust on her face. But alive. She looked at me, and for the first time since Silver Gulch, she smiled like a woman who had nothing left to run from. "I told you I'd find you." And she did. But I knew it wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The courthouse clock hadn't struck midnight when the first threats arrived. Not in letters, whispers, or cold glances, but in gunshots. My room above the saloon shattered glass and splinters as the first bullet tore through the wall. I grabbed Catherine, pulling her down before more shots came. "They're here," she said quietly, eyes sharp despite exhaustion. "They never left. We didn't have time to think. Just move." The badge and journal were packed tight in a satchel, the only evidence standing between us in silence. Carson City wasn't just a town anymore. It was the front line of a war that stretched from dusty plains to marble halls in Washington. Federal agents arrived, suits and badges flashing like armor. But even they whispered about Slade's reachmen in government, shadowy figures who could bury entire cases. Catherine's father hadn't just been a marshal, he was a thorn. And now, we were the next to bleed. The days blurred. Court hearings that felt more like battles. Witnesses disappearing overnight. Evidence vanishing from locked rooms. Each victory was met with a new setback. I watched Catherine crumble and rebuild herself daily, fueled by something deeper than justice, a fire kindled by years of lies and loss. One evening, after a particularly brutal hearing, she pulled me aside. "There's someone you need to meet," she said, voice low. I followed her into the night to a small diner on the outskirts. There, waiting in the shadows, was a man named Gabriel. A former deputy turned whistleblower. He held the key to the conspiracy's heart ledgers, names, bribes, everything Slade tried to bury. But Gabriel's price was steep. "Help me take them down," he said, "or I disappear. And no one ever sees me again." We agreed. Because sometimes, to fight the devil, you have to dance with darkness. Weeks passed in a blur of meetings, secret exchanges, and near misses. Slade's allies struck back harder. Our safe house burned to cinders. A trusted ally turned coat, leaving Catherine exposed. The night she was ambushed, I found her in the alley, bloodied, but breathing. She looked at me with fire in her eyes. They wanted to scare me. They failed. I knew then. The war wasn't just about land or justice. It was about survival. The trial's final day arrived. The courtroom packed with faces, some friends, some foes. Slade sat smug, his empire crumbling but his grin intact. We laid out the evidence, ledger by ledger, witness by witness. Gabriel testified with shaky hands but fierce conviction. Catherine's voice never faltered as she recounted her father's last days. And me? I stood silent, the weight of all we'd endured resting heavy on my shoulders. When the verdict came, silence swallowed the room. Guilty. Slade's empire fell like a house of cards. But victory was bittersweet. Catherine and I knew this was only one battle. The war had changed us, tested our limits, and taken a toll we couldn't yet see. That night, we stood outside the courthouse, hands clasped, eyes locked. "I never wanted this life," she whispered. "Neither did I. But we found each other, and something worth fighting for." Under the stars, in a world still broken, hope flickered. And for the first time in a long time, we believed in the dawn. The night before the final hearing, the air was thick with silence, the kind that presses heavy on your chest, squeezing every breath until it feels like a fight just to live. I sat alone in the dim light of our rented room, the badge and journal laid out before me like relics of a war that had already cost us too much. Catherine was out chasing whispers, hunting shadows, chasing the ghosts that refused to stay buried. She told me once, "Revenge is a fire. You can burn with it, or you can use it to light the way." Tonight, that fire was roaring. Around midnight, the knock came. Not the timid tap of old friends or the cautious rhythm of strangers, no, this was deliberate, confident, cold. I knew who it was before I opened the door. Slade's men, or what was left of them. 5 faces grim, eyes hard as steel, weapons drawn. No talk, no mercy. Idit hesitate. Gun in hand, I stepped into the cold night. The firefight was brutal but brief. Shots rang through the empty streets like thunderclaps. Bullets tore through wood and flesh. I took 2 down before they closed in. But it wasn't enough. A searing pain bloomed in my side, sharp, hot, and immediate. I went down hard. Then, through the haze, I saw her. Catherine, eyes blazing, rifle steady. She cut through them like a storm. Her voice broke through the chaos, sharp and clear. "Get up, Ezekiel. This ends tonight." I gritted my teeth, the pain fading beneath a surge of adrenaline. Together we stood, back to back. 2 warriors bound by blood and broken dreams. We tracked them to Slade's old estate. A crumbling mansion perched on a hill, a fortress built on lies. Inside, the air was thick with dust and desperation. Slade was there, waiting, smiling the cruel smile of a man who believes himself untouchable. "I expected you sooner," he sneered. "But you're too late." No words, no bargains, only the cold steel of justice. We moved as one, each step a promise, each breath a prayer. The final showdown was a dance of death shots echoing in cavernous halls, shadows flickering in candlelight, the scent of gunpowder and sweat hanging heavy. Slade fought like a cornered beast, feral and ruthless. But years of pain had forged us into something stronger. Stronger than fear, stronger than hate, stronger than the past. I cornered him in the grand hall. His gun shook in his hand. My finger tightened on the trigger. He looked into my eyes, saw everything he had taken, everything he had destroyed. Then, a flicker. Fear. The man behind the monster. And I fired. The shot rang out. Slade fell. The empire of lies crumbled, and silence filled the room. Outside, dawn broke. Golden light spilled over the valley, washing away shadows. Catherine and I stood on the porch, battered but alive. No promises were needed. No words could capture what we'd lost or what we'd gained. Just the quiet knowledge that we had survived. Together. The ranch was still ours. The land still thirsty, but hope was alive. Because sometimes the fiercest storms bring the clearest skies. And from the ashes of pain, new life can grow. As the sun climbed higher, I looked at Catherine. Her smile was soft, real, and for the first time, the future didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a promise. This was more than a story about a farm, a marriage, or revenge. It was about standing when the world tried to break you. About finding light when everything is dark. About fighting not just for what you own, but for who you are. And in the end, that's the legacy worth leaving. If you stayed with me till the last word, thank you. For believing in the fight. For knowing that even in the wildest west, hope rides free. If you were in the main character's shoes, would you fight the same battle? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like the video. Explore the other videos on your screen for more unforgettable stories.